The small town of Willow Creek sat quietly between rolling hills and wide stretches of farmland where the wind whispered through tall grass like a soft song. Most people in town believed they knew every story worth knowing, every family history, every secret. In places like Willow Creek, nothing stayed hidden for long. Yet there was one woman whose story people thought they understood but truly did not. Her name was Eleanor Briggs. Eleanor lived in a small white house near the edge of town. Surrounded by a fence she had repaired herself more times than she could remember. Her garden was always neat, her porch swept clean, and her curtains drawn modestly across the windows. But what people noticed most about Eleanor was that she was alone. She had reached the age when most women in town were already raising children or running busy households beside their husbands. Yet Eleanor had never married. In Willow Creek, that fact alone made people curious. Some whispered that she had once been promised to someone who left. Others said she had simply waited too long. A few cruel tongues suggested no man had ever wanted her. Eleanor heard the whispers, though people thought she didn't. But she carried herself with quiet dignity, never responding, never arguing, simply continuing with her life. What most people didn't understand was that Eleanor had once believed love would find her easily. When she was younger, she had been full of hope. She helped her father run their small farm, laughed easily, and dreamed of building a home with someone who shared her love for the peaceful countryside. But time had passed. Her father died 5 years earlier, leaving her the land and the house. She kept everything running as best she could, though farming alone was harder than most people imagined. Still, she worked every day from sunrise until the stars filled the sky. Some evenings she sat quietly on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the road that led past her home. Sometimes wagons passed, sometimes riders, but never anyone who stopped. Eventually she stopped expecting them to. One cool autumn morning, Eleanor loaded a basket of vegetables onto the back of her small wagon and headed into town. The weekly market was busy with farmers selling produce and families gathering supplies. As she arranged her vegetables on the wooden table, she noticed the familiar glances. A group of women whispered nearby, "She's still alone." One murmured. Another replied quietly, "Such a shame." Eleanor pretended not to hear, though her hands paused slightly before continuing their work. Later that afternoon, after selling most of her vegetables, she began packing up. That was when she noticed a man standing across the street. He leaned against a wooden post outside the general store, his hat pulled low and his arms folded loosely. At first she didn't pay much attention. Strangers passed through town often, but something about him felt familiar. When she finished loading her wagon, she climbed onto the seat and started toward home. As she passed the general store, the man finally moved. "Miss Briggs." The sound of her name made her pull the wagon to a stop. She turned. The man stepped forward, lifting his hat slightly. For a moment she simply stared. Then recognition flickered across her face. Thomas Hale smiled gently. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor felt her heart stumble slightly. Thomas Hale had grown up in Willow Creek. Years earlier, he had worked with his father at the neighboring ranch. As children, he and Eleanor often crossed paths at church gatherings and town events. Back then, he had been a quiet boy who kept mostly to himself. But when he turned 20, he left town to find work in the cattle territories out west. That had been nearly 10 years ago. "I heard you came back," Eleanor said slowly. Thomas nodded. "Just arrived this morning." He studied her carefully, though his expression remained warm and respectful. "You look well." Eleanor gave a small smile. Life keeps a person busy. Thomas glanced at the wagon. "Still running the farm?" "Yes." "By yourself?" "Yes." Something thoughtful passed through his eyes. "Well," he said gently, "you were always stronger than most folks gave you credit for." The words surprised her. Few people in town ever said such things. They spoke for a few minutes more before Elinor had to leave. As she guided the wagon down the road toward home, she couldn't help glancing back once. Thomas was still standing there watching her go. The next few days passed normally, but then something unusual happened. One afternoon, while Elinor worked in her garden, she heard the sound of hooves approaching the gate. She looked up. Thomas sat on a chestnut horse outside the fence. He tipped his hat politely. Afternoon. Elinor brushed dirt from her hands and walked over. "Passing through?" she asked. "Not exactly." He gestured toward the field. "Mind if I lend a hand?" She blinked. "With what?" "Well," he said with a small grin, "that fence looks like it's about ready to fall over." Elinor looked at the fence. "He wasn't wrong. You don't have to do that," she said. Thomas shrugged. "I know." But he dismounted anyway. That afternoon they worked side by side repairing the broken fence. At first their conversation was simple, mostly about the farm and the changes in town. But slowly the years between them began to fade. Thomas was still quiet, but there was something steady about him now. The long years of ranch work had made him stronger, more confident, and yet he still listened the same way he had as a boy, carefully, respectfully. When the sun began to set, the fence stood straighter than it had in years. Thomas stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Looks better." Elinor nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated slightly before climbing onto his horse. "I might stop by again," he said. "You're welcome to." And he did. Over the next several weeks, Thomas visited often. Sometimes he helped with repairs. Sometimes he brought supplies from town. Other times he simply sat on the porch with Elinor while they talked about life and the years that had passed. The townspeople noticed quickly. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some were surprised. Others were skeptical. But Elinor tried not to listen. Still, one evening as she and Thomas sat watching the sunset, she finally spoke the thought that had been growing in her mind. "You don't have to keep coming here," she said quietly. Thomas looked at her. "I know. People are talking. They always do." Elinor sighed softly. "You should probably find someone your own age to court." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "Why would I do that?" She looked down at her hands. "Because no one's ever wanted to marry me." The words hung in the air. Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he stood and walked a few steps toward the fence, staring out at the fields. Finally he turned back. "Elinor," he said gently, "do you know why I left Willow Creek all those years ago?" She shook her head. "I left because I didn't have anything to offer you." Her breath caught. Thomas continued slowly. "You were always the smartest, kindest woman in this town. I figured if I ever asked you to marry me, I'd better come back with something worth giving." Elinor stared at him, stunned. "You what?" Thomas gave a small nervous laugh. "I suppose I should have said something sooner. You waited 10 years." She whispered. He nodded, worked cattle, saved every dollar, built a small ranch of my own. The world around Elinor seemed to grow very quiet.